The stars were calm and silent around the white hospital ship named Hope's Mercy. It carried hundreds of wounded soldiers and many civilians who had been rescued from battle zones. Inside the ship, the air was filled with the soft hum of machines and the low voices of doctors and nurses moving quickly through the long halls. The war was far away, and everyone believed the Hope's Mercy was safe because it was marked as a medical ship. No one thought anyone would dare to attack it. Dr. Laura Bennett walked through the main ward, checking on her patients. She was in her late 30s, with tired eyes and steady hands. She had been working without rest, but she refused to stop. Every man, woman, and child on this ship was her responsibility. She smiled gently at a little boy who had lost his parents in the war and gave him a soft blanket. She whispered that he would be safe here. In another section of the ship, Daniel Cross sat alone in a quiet engineering room. He was a man in his early 40s, tall, with dark hair that had begun to gray at the edges. He was not a soldier, but an engineer who had been asked to repair and manage systems on the ship. He preferred to stay out of attention, always working in silence. Many thought of him as strange, but he had a mind sharper than most people could imagine. He kept to himself, solving problems no one else wanted to think about. The ship moved slowly through space, carrying hope and healing. But hope could not protect them from cruelty. Without warning, the alarms screamed through the halls. The red lights flashed, and the calm silence was replaced by shouts and confusion. The crew on the bridge shouted that an unknown fleet had appeared out of nowhere. Before anyone could react, the first attack hit. The ship trembled under the blow of alien weapons. The Drexari had come. They were a ruthless alien empire that showed no mercy. They cared nothing for the rules of war, and to them, a hospital ship was simply an easy target. Their ships were dark and sharp, like blades moving through space. They surrounded the Hope's Mercy and fired again and again. Laura rushed to cover the patients as explosions shook the walls. Glass shattered, beds rolled, and the wounded cried out in fear. She shouted to the nurses to move the critical patients to the secure section of the ward. Smoke filled the air as systems sparked and burned. She kept moving, refusing to let fear control her. Daniel was thrown to the floor when the second blast hit. He pulled himself up, his mind already racing. He checked the systems, but he knew the truth. The Hope's Mercy had no weapons. It had no shields strong enough to fight. It was built to heal, not to survive a battle. The Drexari had chosen it because it was defenseless through the viewports. Survivors saw the Drexari ships firing with cold precision. Every blast was meant to destroy. There was no chance for surrender. The crew tried to send distress calls, but the signals were jammed. The hospital ship was alone. In the chaos, Laura helped push a stretcher, carrying a soldier who could not walk. The halls were filled with smoke and sparks, but she kept moving forward, guiding survivors toward the escape pods. Her voice was calm, even as fear grew around her. She knew panic would only kill faster than fire. Daniel ran through the engineering halls, helping crew members reach the escape pods. His thoughts burned with anger and disbelief. He could not understand why anyone would waste power and ships just to destroy the helpless. He wanted to fight back, but there was nothing on board that could fight. Still, he refused to give in. He guided people out, helping them into pods, pushing the buttons that sent them away. The Drexari showed no hesitation. Their blasts tore through the ship's hull, ripping it apart piece by piece. The screams of metal echoed through the halls. People cried out for help, some trapped under debris, some already lost to the fire. Laura and Daniel found themselves in the same corridor as the lights flickered and dimmed. She looked at him with determination, even as smoke stung her eyes. He did not speak, but he nodded. They both understood they had to survive, not for themselves, but for the others who had already died. Together, they pushed toward the last escape pods. Laura carried a child in her arms, holding him close. Daniel helped an older man who could barely walk. Behind them, the corridor collapsed in fire. The hospital ship was breaking apart. At the final moment, Daniel forced the escape pod door open. He pulled Laura inside with the child and the man, then sealed it shut. The pod launched away as another explosion ripped through the Hope's Mercy. Through the small window, they saw the hospital ship consumed in fire, a white light fading into dust and wreckage among the stars. The silence after the destruction was colder than anything they had ever felt. The Hope's Mercy was gone. Hundreds of lives had been lost, and only a few pods scattered into the dark. Inside the pod, Laura held the child close, tears streaming down her face. Daniel sat across from her, his jaw tight, his eyes staring into the blackness where the Drexari ships still moved like predators. Something inside him hardened in that moment. He felt the pain and the loss, but deeper than that, he felt a fire begin to burn. He whispered to himself, a promise no one else heard. The Drexari would pay. The pod drifted quietly into the void, carrying survivors who had nothing left but each other, and carrying one man whose mind was about to change the fate of the galaxy. Forever asterisk, the escape pod drifted silently through space. Inside, the small group of survivors sat close together, the air heavy with fear and sorrow. The memory of the hospital ship's destruction was still sharp in their minds. Every time they closed their eyes, they saw the fire, heard the screams, and felt the walls tremble as the ship tore apart. No one spoke at first. The silence was too deep, broken only by the quiet hum of the pod's weak systems. Laura Bennett held the little boy against her chest. He was trembling, and his eyes were wide with shock. She whispered soft words to him, telling him he was safe now. Her own heart was heavy, but she forced her voice to remain calm. The survivors needed strength, and she refused to let her fear show. The older man she had helped into the pod sat slumped in the corner, breathing hard but alive. Across from her sat Daniel Cross. He stared out the small window of the pod into the endless dark. His face was cold, his eyes hard. The others might have thought he was in shock, but his mind was awake and moving faster than ever. He was replaying everything he had seen, every blast, every maneuver of the Drexari ships, every weakness in their formation. His thoughts were sharp, cutting through the haze of fear. Hours passed as the pod drifted, its signal beacon blinking weakly into space. Finally, a human patrol ship picked up the survivors. Soldiers pulled them aboard and carried the wounded to safety. Laura quickly moved to help the medical staff, working as if she had never left the hospital ship. She did not care about her own exhaustion. She cared only for the lives that were still breathing. Daniel was quiet as the soldiers questioned him. They wanted to know what had happened, but he answered with short words, giving only the details they needed. Inside, though, he burned with anger. He knew the Drexari had not just attacked a ship. They had attacked the very heart of humanity by destroying a vessel of healing. It was more than cruelty. It was a message, and he understood it clearly. They wanted humans to feel powerless, but Daniel refused to feel powerless. As he sat alone in a small corner of the patrol ship, he made a promise to himself. He would not let this crime be forgotten. The Drexari thought they had silenced the weak, but they had awakened something far more dangerous. They had awakened him. In the days that followed, Daniel kept to himself. While others grieved, he worked in silence. He found his way into the ship's engineering bay and asked for tools. At first, the crew laughed at him. He was just another survivor, a civilian with tired eyes and a haunted face. But when they saw the way his hands moved over broken machines, the way he repaired circuits faster than the trained engineers, they stopped laughing. Daniel began to draw on old scraps of metal, sketching designs with a focus so sharp that it unsettled those who watched him. He did not draw pictures of beauty. He drew weapons. He imagined ships that could fight back, traps that could cripple alien fleets, and machines that turned the weak into the strong. His hands shook as he worked, not from fear, but from the fire that would not leave him. Laura noticed the change. In him, she approached him one evening, her white coat stained from long hours of work with the wounded. She placed a hand gently on the table where he was drawing. "You have not spoken much," she said softly. "You should rest. You've been through the same loss as the rest of us." Daniel looked up at her, his face pale in the dim light. "Rest?" he asked, his voice low. "While they burn more ships, while they slaughter more children. Rest will not stop them. Ideas will." Laura saw the intensity in his eyes and felt a chill. She knew he was right in one way. The Drexari would not stop unless someone stopped them. But she also worried. His anger was strong, and she could see it. Was pushing him toward a dangerous path. Asterisk. "You're only one man," she reminded him. "You can't fight an empire alone." Daniel shook his head slowly. "One man with a right mind can change everything. They believe we are weak. I will show them how wrong they are." In the days that followed, Daniel began to gain attention. The engineers on the ship noticed the speed of his work. The officers noticed how his ideas were not just creative, but effective. He explained weaknesses in Drexari's ship design that no one had noticed before. He suggested traps using common tools, things so simple that the alien minds would never expect them. At first, the officers dismissed him. But when his suggestions saved the patrol ship from an ambush, they started listening. Word spread through the human fleet. Survivors whispered about the quiet man who saw things no one else could see. They said he was turning grief into fire, that he could twist broken metal into weapons, and that maybe, just maybe, he was the mind humanity needed. Laura watched all of this with mixed feelings. She was proud of his brilliance, but she was afraid of where it might lead him. He was no longer just Daniel Cross, the quiet engineer. He was becoming something else, something larger. His resolve was clear, and it was as sharp as a blade. Every night, as the fleet moved through the stars, Daniel sat awake, drawing, building, and planning. The Drexari thought they had won when they destroyed the Hope's Mercy. But Daniel knew the truth. They had only created the very thing that would one day bring their empire to its knees. Asterisk, the human fleet was always moving now, never resting in one place for too long. The Drexari hunted them like wolves, waiting for a chance to strike. Each ship in the fleet carried scars from battles, and each crew carried grief from lives already lost. But in the shadows of this broken fleet, one man worked with a kind of fire no one else could understand. Daniel Cross spent most of his days in the lower sections of the ships. Far from the noise of command, he asked for access to scrap piles, damaged drones, and old weapon systems that no one thought were useful anymore. Most people ignored him, thinking he was just another survivor keeping himself busy. But those who worked near him soon realized that Daniel was not simply tinkering. He was building something new. He sat in front of broken engines and shattered drones, his hands moving quickly, his eyes sharp and restless. He stripped wires, rewired circuits, and melted metal into new shapes. At first, the engineers laughed at his strange ideas. A civilian trying to invent weapons from scraps sounded foolish. But then his machines started to work. One night, while most of the ship was quiet, Daniel revealed his first creation. He had taken an old mining drone, a machine once used to cut through rock, and transformed it into a silent weapon. Its cutters had been reshaped into blades, its sensors tuned to track Drexari energy signatures. He called it a hunter. When the engineers tested it, the small drone moved with deadly precision, cutting through metal targets like paper. The engineers stared in silence, their smiles fading into disbelief. It was clear this was no ordinary mind at work. Daniel had seen what others could not. He had taken a tool for peace and reshaped it into a weapon for survival. Laura Bennett visited him often, though she was always busy with her medical work. She found him late at night, his hands blackened with grease, his eyes burning with focus. She worried about him, about the way he worked without sleep, without food, as if nothing else existed. "You cannot keep doing this to yourself," she said one evening, her voice calm but firm. "You need rest. You're wearing yourself down." Daniel barely looked up from the circuit he was welding. "Rest will not save us. Every hour I waste is another hour they prepare to strike again." Laura sighed and stepped closer, placing a hand on the table where sparks had just fallen. "You're one man. You can't carry all of this on your shoulders." Daniel finally met her eyes. His voice was quiet but sharp. "I can carry enough to make a difference. That's all that matters." His work spread quickly through the fleet. Commanders who had once ignored him began sending him broken weapons and captured alien parts. Daniel studied every piece of Drexari technology with hungry eyes, breaking it apart, learning how it worked, and finding ways to use it against them. Where the aliens used brute force, Daniel found precision. Where they relied on advanced systems, Daniel used simplicity that was harder to predict. In 1 week, he built hidden mines from discarded fuel cells, small enough to fit in cargo crates, but strong enough to cripple a Drexari ship if it passed too close. In another, he redesigned the shields on one of the smaller patrol vessels, strengthening it with a clever arrangement of old energy coils. The ship survived an attack that should have destroyed it. The soldiers started to whisper his name. Some called him the Ghost Maker. Others called him the Man of Fire. Rumors spread that he could turn broken metal into blades sharper than anything the Drexari had. To the wounded and the hopeless, he became a symbol. If one man could fight back, maybe all of humanity could. But Daniel did not see himself as a symbol. He saw himself as a builder of war. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the hospital ship exploding, the children crying, the fire tearing through the halls. That memory drove his hands faster, sharper, harder. He was not just inventing weapons. He was preparing revenge. Laura noticed the change in him more than anyone else. She admired his brilliance, but she also feared it. There was a coldness growing inside him, something that made him less gentle and more dangerous. She tried to remind him of the lives they were saving, but he only nodded, his thoughts already moving to the next design. One night, a Drexari scout ship found the fleet. It slipped through the stars, small but armed, ready to call in a larger force. Panic spread as alarms sounded, but Daniel was already prepared. He had loaded his modified mining drones onto one of the smaller ships. When the scout approached, the drones were released. They moved silently, their sensors locking onto the Drexar ship. In moments, the scout was shredded by blades that came from the darkness. Its metal torn apart until it drifted dead in space. The human fleet cheered. It was their first clean victory in weeks. The officers who had doubted Daniel now looked at him with respect, and perhaps fear. He had done what none of them had thought possible. He had turned scraps into weapons and used them to kill. For Daniel, it was not a victory. It was only the beginning. He stood on the deck of the patrol ship, looking out at the wreck of the Drexari scout. His jaw was tight, his eyes unblinking. To him, the destruction of one small ship was nothing compared to the fire that still burned inside. The Drexari had taken everything from him, and he would not stop until the galaxy itself was reshaped by his hands. The survivors around him cheered his name, but Laura stood back, silent. She looked at Daniel and wondered what kind of man he was becoming. He was saving lives, yes. But he was also changing, and she feared where that path might lead. In the cold silence of space, Daniel Cross kept working, his mind racing with designs no one else could imagine. He was not just an engineer anymore. He was becoming the weapon humanity needed. And the Drexari had no idea what was about to rise against them. The human fleet had been running for too long. Every day felt like a retreat. Every battle a desperate attempt to survive. But now something was changing. Daniel Cross had given them weapons, not perfect weapons, not advanced by the standards of the galaxy, but clever ones that worked. For the first time since the hospital ship was destroyed, hope began to grow inside the hearts of the soldiers. The fleet received news that a Plexori raiding squad was moving toward a mining colony on the edge of human space. The colony had no defenses, only miners and families living under the rock of a cold moon. If the Drexari reached them, there would be nothing but fire and death. The commanders debated what to do. They did not want to risk their few remaining ships. But Daniel stepped forward. "Give me a chance," he said in a calm, firm voice. "I have a plan. Let me test it." Some of the officers hesitated. They still did not trust him. He was a civilian, and his inventions were untested in a real battle. But others remembered the Drexari scout ship torn apart by his drones. In the end, the commanders agreed. They had no other choice. Daniel worked without pause, preparing his weapons. He had modified more drones, added hidden charges to supply crates, and built decoys to confuse Drexari sensors. His mind was always moving, seeing the battlefield not as it was, but as it could be. Laura Bennett found him one evening, bent over a half-broken circuit. "Are you sure this will work?" she asked quietly. Daniel looked up at her with tired eyes. "It has to work. If it doesn't, the colony dies." The fleet moved into position near the mining colony, hiding behind asteroids and broken rock. The Drexari squadron arrived soon after, dark ships, gliding forward with cruel confidence. They were not expecting resistance. They had destroyed too many human ships already to believe this colony could fight back. Daniel gave the signal. The first step of his plan was silence. The Drexar ships moved closer, their sensors scanning, their weapons charging. Then, from the shadow of an asteroid, one of Daniel's decoys flickered to life. It broadcast the signal of a large human warship. The Drexari turned toward it at once, eager to destroy it. But when they fired, their blasts hit nothing but empty rock. While the aliens were distracted, Daniel released his drones. Small and silent, they drifted through space like broken scraps of metal. The Drexari ignored them, not realizing what they were. Then, as they moved into range, the drones came alive. Blades cut, charges exploded, and the Drexari's smallest ship was torn apart before it could even fire. The human fleet opened fire next. Old guns and patched-up cannons spat fire into the dark. It was not the strongest barrage, but it was enough. One Drexari cruiser reeled under the assault. The hidden charges Daniel had placed in drifting cargo crates ignited as the enemy passed too close, tearing holes in another ship's hull. The Drexari were stunned. This was not the broken, weak humanity they remembered. This was something sharper. Something unexpected. They regrouped quickly, their larger ships unleashing heavy fire. A human vessel was hit, flames spreading across its hull. Laura rushed to the medical bay, tending to the wounded as screams filled the corridors. On the command deck, Daniel's eyes never left the battle screen. He gave orders calmly, telling ships when to move, when to fire, when to release the next wave of drones. He seemed to see everything at once, every angle, every possibility. To him, the Drexari were not gods of war. They were a problem to be solved, a puzzle with weaknesses waiting to be broken. The battle raged on. One human ship was lost, but 2 Drexari cruisers fell to Daniel's traps. At last, their leader realized the danger. The squadron began to retreat, unwilling to waste more ships against this strange resistance. The humans did not chase them. They had already won more than they had dared to hope. When the silence returned to space, the human fleet cheered. 4. The first time, they had stood their ground and forced the enemy to run. Soldiers hugged one another, tears filled their eyes, and hope spread like fire through the colony. The Drexari could bleed. They could be beaten. But Daniel did not celebrate. He stood apart, his face hard and thoughtful. To him, this victory was only a test. He had proven his designs worked. But he also saw what remained unfinished, what could be improved. His mind was already moving toward the next battle, the next weapon, the next trap. Laura found him in the quiet of the engineering bay after the fight. She placed a hand on his shoulder and whispered, "You gave them hope today. You saved lives." Daniel shook his head slowly. "No, I only showed them how to fight. The war is far from over, and it will only get worse." She looked into his eyes and saw the fire burning there, brighter than ever. It frightened her, but she also knew it was the reason they had survived. As the human fleet repaired its ships and the colony gave thanks for its rescue, the Drexari carried news back to their empire. News of a man who turned broken machines into weapons. News of traps that shredded their ships. News of a genius who had risen from the ashes of a hospital ship. The Drexari had expected an easy kill. Instead, they had met the first strike of a mind that would not forgive, and they did not yet understand what storm they had awakened. The Drexari Empire had never feared humans before. To them, humanity was young, fragile, and weak compared. 2 older races of the galaxy. But after the battle near the mining colony, whispers began to spread among Drexari commanders. Their ships had been destroyed not by overwhelming force, but by clever traps and strange machines they had never seen before. Some called it luck, but others feared there was something more behind it. They began to speak of a shadow in the human fleet, a mind that twisted weakness into strength. Among the humans, Daniel Cross became a name carried in every corner of the fleet. Soldiers spoke of him with respect and sometimes with unease. The wounded saw him as the man who gave them a chance to fight back. The commanders saw him as dangerous, a man who did not follow orders but still delivered results. And Laura Bennett saw him as a man slowly being consumed by the fire inside him. Daniel worked without pause. After every battle, he studied the wreckage of Drexari ships, pulling out broken parts, scanning strange circuits, and filling notebooks with sketches and notes. He often worked alone, but sometimes engineers came to watch, hoping to learn. He explained things in simple words, but the speed of his thoughts left most of them behind. His ideas were not like the standard designs of the fleet. He saw war as a puzzle, and every piece of wreckage was a clue. The Drexari tried to adapt. They changed their formations, they adjusted their weapons, but Daniel was always watching. He noticed every adjustment and found ways to counter it. If their ships turned faster, he built drones that could slip inside their turning arcs. If their shields grew stronger, he designed mines that exploded in patterns to break through. With every step the aliens took, Daniel was already thinking 2 steps ahead. The humans began to win small battles. They were not victories that ended the war, but they mattered. Colonies that would have fallen were saved. Convoys that would have been destroyed made it through. Each time the Drexari lost ships they could not replace quickly. And each time the humans gained more courage. But courage also brought fear. Some officers in the human command began to whisper that Daniel was too dangerous. He was not a trained soldier, and he did not obey the chain of command. He gave orders in battles that were followed because they worked, not because he had the right to give them. To some, he was a savior. To others, he was a threat. Daniel did not care about politics. He cared only about results. Late at night, when the fleet was quiet, he sat alone, staring at the stars. The memory of the hospital ship never left him. He could still hear the screams, still see the fire tearing through the halls. That memory sharpened every design, pushed every idea forward. It was not only about survival anymore. It was about making the Drexery feel what he had felt. Laura watched him carefully. She worked long hours in the medical bays, healing the wounded and comforting the broken. She saw the way soldiers looked at Daniel with both hope and unease. And she saw the way Daniel looked at his machines as if they were pieces of himself. One evening, she found him staring at a piece of Drexery technology he had pulled from a wreck. It glowed faintly, its surface covered with symbols. His eyes were locked on it, and his hands moved over it with a kind of obsession. "You're pushing yourself too far," she said softly. Daniel did not look up. "Far enough. You can't carry this war alone," she told him. "People believe in you, yes, but you're not the only one who has to fight. If you lose yourself, what happens then?" For a moment, he was silent. Then he looked at her, his face hard but tired. "If I stop, more ships burn. If I rest, more children die. I won't let that happen. Not again." Laura saw the truth in his words, but she also saw the danger. His mind was brilliant, but his heart was closing itself to everything except war. She wondered how long it would be before his humanity slipped away. The Drexery grew more desperate. They began sending larger fleets determined to crush the humans before this strange genius could grow stronger. But each time, Daniel found a way to turn the battle. His traps grew more complex, his drones more deadly. The human fleet followed his guidance, often without question, because he gave them something no one else could give: victories. Fear spread through the Drexery ranks. Captains told stories of invisible machines that shredded their ships, of human weapons that came from nowhere, of a ghostly mind that turned every battle against them. They began to call him the Ghost of Steel, a name that carried weight even among their hardened warriors. But within the human fleet, fear also grew. Commanders argued behind closed doors. Was Daniel a hero, or was he becoming something too powerful, something no one could control? Some believed he was the only reason they were still alive. Others believed he might become a danger to humans as well as Drexery. Daniel heard the whispers, but he did not care. He worked, he built, he planned, was not fighting for titles or recognition. He was fighting because he had seen what happened when no one fought back. He had seen helpless people burned in fire. And he had sworn never to let it happen again. As the Drexery fled from one more failed raid, Daniel stood on the deck, his eyes fixed on the retreating ships. Around him, the crew cheered, but his face was still, his voice quiet. "They're learning to fear us," he whispered. "Good. Let them fear. It's only the beginning." Laura stood a few steps away, watching him. She felt both relief and unease. The Drexery were afraid, but so was she. Afraid of what Daniel was becoming, afraid of the fire that drove him, and afraid of how far it might carry him before the war was over. Asterisk. The Drexery Empire could not ignore the losses anymore. Too many ships had been destroyed. Too many raids had ended in failure. Their leaders demanded results, and their admirals grew desperate. They decided on a bold strike. Instead of chasing the human fleet, they would attack a human colony directly. If they destroyed it, they believed the humans would lose hope, and the mysterious genius among them would be forced to appear. The chosen target was a farming colony on a green world, called Haven's Reach. It was a place of families and children, far from the war's front lines. The colony had no defenses strong enough to stop even a small Drexari fleet. When the aliens arrived, their ships filled the sky, blocking out the sun. Panic spread through the colony. People rushed to shelters, but they knew shelters would not stop energy fire. The distress call went out, begging for help. The human fleet received the signal, and fear spread among the commanders. They knew their ships were outnumbered. The Drexari had brought a fleet too large to fight directly. Some officers argued to fall back, to save what they could, instead of risking everything. But Daniel Cross stood in the middle of the command. Deccan spoke with a calm voice. If we run, they win. If we fight on their terms, we lose. But if we fight on my terms, we can make them bleed. His words carried weight. He explained his plan, his voice steady, his mind already calculating every move. It was dangerous, and it would require trust, but it was the only chance. In the end, the commanders gave him control. Daniel worked with feverish speed. He prepared drones, mines, and hidden charges. He ordered ships to move into positions that made no sense to the officers, hiding behind moons, drifting through asteroid belts, waiting in silence. The colony prepared for the worst, but Daniel prepared for a trap. The Drexari fleet entered the system with confidence. Their ships were larger, stronger, and faster. They expected a quick victory. As they closed in on the colony, Daniel gave the signal. The first wave of drones drifted out, disguised as harmless debris. The Drexari ignored them until the debris exploded into blades and fire. Crippling their lead ship, the human fleet moved then, not in a straight line, but in sharp, sudden strikes. Daniel directed every move, his voice calm over the comms. Hold fire, now strike. Pull back, turn here. His orders cut through the chaos, and the fleet obeyed. The humans fought like shadows, never giving the Drexari a clear target, striking from angles no one expected. Laura worked in the medical bay, hearing only fragments of the battle through the comms. She moved quickly among the wounded, her hands steady even as the ship shook with enemy fire. Every time she looked at the faces of the soldiers, she thought of Daniel. He was out there, guiding them, shaping the fight with his mind. The Drexari tried to push forward, but every move met resistance. Mines hidden near the colony's moon exploded, tearing holes in their formation. Drones slipped into blind spots, stabbing at engines and weapons. Smaller human ships darted in and out, like knives cutting at larger beasts. For the first time, the Drexari realized they were not hunters anymore. They were the hunted hours. Passed, and the battle dragged on. The humans lost ships, and the colony shook under near hits, but the Drexari paid dearly. One by one, their cruisers fell, burning in the sky above Haven's Reach. At last, their admiral ordered a retreat. The mighty Drexari fleet turned and fled, leaving behind wreckage and silence. On the ground, the colonists poured from their shelters, staring in disbelief at the sky. Instead of fire raining down, they saw alien ships retreating, chased away by a fleet that should never have been able to win. Hope spread through the colony like sunlight after a storm. They had been spared. Humanity had fought back and won. In the command deck, the soldiers cheered. Officers shook hands, crews hugged each other, and relief filled the air. But Daniel stood apart, his eyes fixed on the battle map. His mind was already moving, already calculating the next step. He had seen the Drexari retreat, but he knew this was not the end. This was only the beginning of something larger. Later, as the fleet repaired, Laura found him in the engineering bay, staring at wreckage from a Drexari ship. She placed her hand on the cold metal beside him. "You saved them," she said softly. "You saved the colony. You gave them something to believe in. Daniel did not smile. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper. I didn't save them. I showed the Drexari what fear feels like. That is only the first lesson. Laura looked at him with mixed emotions. She admired him, yes, but she also felt a deep unease. His victories were turning him into something more than a man. The soldiers saw him as a leader, the fleet saw him as their best hope, and the Drexari saw him as a nightmare. But she saw the fire inside him, burning hotter with every battle. She wondered how long he could carry it before it consumed him. The galaxy had shifted. Humanity was no longer only defending. For the first time, they had struck back and forced their enemy to retreat. Daniel Cross had turned the impossible into reality. And as the Drexari licked their wounds and planned their revenge, Daniel's mind was already shaping the next move, one that would change the war forever. The victory at Haven's Reach spread across human space like a spark in dry grass. Colonists, who once felt hopeless, now walked with pride. Soldiers spoke of Daniel Cross in whispers, as if he were more than a man, as if he were a force that could not be stopped. The Drexari had retreated, and that alone was enough to give humanity new courage. But every victory came with a price, and soon the weight of that price began to show. Daniel spent long nights alone in the command deck, staring at star maps and patterns of enemy movements. He barely slept, and when he did, his dreams were filled with numbers and calculations, battles replaying in his mind. He carried the responsibility of every soldier who died, every family that still grieved. The others saw him as unshakable, but Laura noticed the way his hands trembled when no one else was looking. Laura tried to reach him. She brought him meals, sat with him in silence, and reminded him that he was not alone. But Daniel rarely spoke of his own feelings. Instead, he buried himself deeper into his work. He believed that if he stopped, even for a moment, the Drexari would gain the upper hand. His brilliance was both his strength and his curse. The human fleet, though victorious, was exhausted. Ships were damaged, supplies were stretched thin, and many crews mourned fallen friends. Some officers began to worry that they were asking too much from Daniel. They respected his mind, but they feared his plans were too risky. He had saved them before, yes, but how long could luck or genius last against an empire that spanned the stars? Tension grew during the next war council. A group of senior commanders argued that the fleet needed to regroup and protect the core colonies instead of following Daniel's bold strategies. They believed it was reckless to keep striking at the Drexari. Daniel listened quietly as they spoke, his eyes cold, his jaw tight. When they finished, he stood and spoke with calm precision. If we hide, they will find us. If we wait, they will grow stronger. The only path is forward. We cannot let them think they control the war. We must shape it, not endure it. His words silenced the room. Some agreed with him, others did not, but none could deny the results he had delivered. In the end, they gave him the authority he demanded, though not without doubt, as the fleet prepared for the next campaign, the price of genius began to show more clearly. Daniel grew more distant from the people around him. He spoke less with Laura, though she stayed by his side whenever she could. He stopped joining the crews in their small celebrations after missions. He spent all his energy studying Drexari tactics, breaking down their strengths and weaknesses as if solving a puzzle. One evening, Laura confronted him. She found him in the observation deck, staring at the stars with a blank expression. You can't keep doing this to yourself, she said softly. You are carrying everything alone, and it's breaking you. The soldiers don't just need your mind, Daniel. They need your heart too. He turned to her, his eyes tired but sharp. If I give them my heart, I will fail them. My mind is what keeps them alive. That is all that matters. Laura shook her head. You're wrong. They Fight because they believe in you. If you become nothing but a machine, they'll lose that belief, and I'll lose you too. Her words lingered with him, though he did not answer. He looked back at the stars, silent, lost in thought. While Daniel wrestled with his burden, the Drexari were not idle. Their leaders, humiliated by the retreat at Haven's Reach, prepared a counterattack on a scale never seen before. They gathered fleets from across their empire, determined to crush the humans once and for all. Their spies also whispered of Daniel Cross, the human who had turned battles upside down. They gave him a name in their own tongue, one that meant the shadow of ruin. Daniel knew they would come with greater force, and he prepared for it. He developed new traps, new formations, and new ways to turn weakness into strength. But even as he built plans that no one else could imagine, he felt the growing distance between himself and the people. Around him, the soldiers began to follow him with blind faith. They cheered his name, painted it on the sides of their ships, and called him their savior. Some even began to ignore the orders of their direct commanders, waiting instead for Daniel's voice over the comms. Admirals who had once commanded with confidence now felt like shadows in his presence. This caused resentment, but they could not deny that Daniel's strategies worked. Laura worried most of all. She saw the way the war was shaping Daniel into something larger than life. The man she cared for was slipping away, replaced by a figure that others worshipped and feared. She wondered if there would be anything left of him once the war was over, if he even believed there could be peace after. All this, the galaxy watched closely. To the Drexari, he was a threat that had to be destroyed. To humanity, he was a hope they could not afford to lose. And to Laura, he was a man standing on the edge of something dangerous. A man whose mind could save millions, but whose soul was slowly being consumed by the weight of his own genius. The price of victory was heavy, and Daniel carried it alone. Every choice he made, every plan he set in motion pushed him further from the man he had been. The war was far from over, but already it was clear that when it ended, Daniel Cross would not be the same. The Drexari came with fire and fury. Their fleets darkened the stars, more ships than humanity had ever faced. They had learned from their defeats, and this time they did not underestimate their enemy. Entire armadas moved together, their weapons ready to crush the human fleet once and for all. The sky above the colony of Vera turned into a storm of warships, each one carrying the promise of destruction. Daniel stood at the center of the command deck, silent and calm, his eyes fixed on the holographic display of the battle. Around him, officers whispered nervously, their hands shaking as they watched the scale of the invasion. Fear spread through the ranks, but Daniel did not show any fear. His voice, when it finally broke the silence, was steady and sharp. "This is the moment we were born for," he said. "They believe they can end us with numbers, but numbers are not victory. Minds are victory. Will is victory. And today, we will show them that humanity does not break." The soldiers listened, and the fear in their eyes slowly turned to fire. They believed him. They always did. Ships moved into position, forming the traps and maneuvers Daniel had planned for weeks. Every move was precise, every formation a step in a puzzle only he could see. The battle began with a roar of light and sound. Beams of energy tore across the void. Missiles streaked through space, and ships exploded in burning fragments. The Drexari pushed forward with overwhelming force, tearing apart the front lines. For every human ship destroyed, 3 more Drexari appeared. It seemed hopeless. But then Daniel's traps began to spring. Entire wings of Drexari cruisers were lured into ambushes where hidden human ships waited in silence. Gravity mines detonated, pulling enemy vessels into collisions with each other. Small fighter squadrons darted like wasps, striking weak points in the larger Drexari ships before vanishing into clouds of debris. The chaos spread, and for the first time, the Drexari advance slowed. Daniel gave orders with calm precision, his mind racing faster than any computer. He saw patterns where others saw only noise. He predicted the Drexari moves before they happened, guiding his fleet like a conductor leading a symphony of war. Every order saved lives. Every choice shifted the balance. But the Drexari were relentless. Their leader, a massive warlord named Krivak, refused to retreat. He threw wave after wave at the humans, determined to break through. Hours passed, and the battlefield was littered with wreckage. Human ships were burning, and the crews were exhausted. But still, they fought on. Laura stayed by Daniel's side, helping relay orders, watching him with both awe and fear. She saw how deeply he was lost in the fight, how his eyes seemed to glow with a strange light, as if his mind existed beyond the limits of flesh. She feared that he was pushing himself too far, that he might never come back from the edge he was walking. At last, Krivak's flagship entered the center of the battle. It was a monster of a ship, larger than anything the humans possessed, bristling with weapons that could destroy entire cities. The sight of it struck terror into many. But Daniel only leaned forward, his voice calm. "This is it," he said. "The head of the serpent. If we cut it off, the body will fall." He devised a plan in seconds. It was bold, dangerous, and almost impossible, but it was their only chance. He ordered several ships to create a false opening, luring Krivak's flagship into range. At the same time, he sent his best pilots into the heart of the enemy formation, weaving through fire and death to deliver a single decisive strike. The trap worked. Krivak, proud and arrogant, charged forward, believing victory was at hand. He did not see the hidden charges planted in the wreckage around him, nor the swarm of human fighters closing in from behind. In a single moment, Daniel gave the order. Explosions lit the darkness, tearing open the shields of the flagship. Human fighters dove into the breach, striking its core with everything they had. The Drexari flagship burned, and with it, their will to fight shattered. The rest of the enemy fleet faltered, their formations breaking apart. Without their leader, they scattered in confusion, and the human fleet pressed the attack. The tide turned, and slowly, painfully, the Drexari were driven back. When the last of the enemy ships fled into the dark, the battlefield was silent. Human crews cheered, wept, and embraced one another. Against all odds, they had survived. They had won. On the command deck, Daniel did not celebrate. He stood quietly, his face pale, his body trembling from exhaustion. Laura touched his arm gently. Her voice soft. "You did it. You saved us all." Daniel shook his head. "We did it. Humanity did it. I was only the guide." But deep down, he knew the truth. His mind had been the blade that turned the war, and the weight of that knowledge pressed heavily on him. He had given everything of himself, and though he was alive, he felt as though some part of him had been left behind in the fire. The galaxy would remember this battle. Songs would be sung of Daniel Cross, the man who turned despair into victory, the genius who brought giants to their knees. To the Drexari, his name would forever be a curse. To humanity, it would be a beacon of hope. Yet as the fleet set course for home, Daniel stared at the stars with quiet eyes. He had saved humanity, yes, but he wondered what kind of man he had become in the process. He wondered if peace was truly possible, or if war had changed them all too deeply. For now, the galaxy was safe, and humanity stood tall. But Daniel Cross knew the truth that no one else wanted to admit. The war was over, but the price of victory would never fade. Asterisk,